Hey everyone, my name is Parth and this is Esports Contracts 101. I streamed this and took a few questions on April 10th, thought it would just be easier if I re-recorded this. So, what is this? This is basic information meant for players in amateur and academy with very little or no experience, so they know what questions to ask and to make better decisions. What this is not going to include is specific information about teams, agents, players, or any of my opinions on them. Not going to include any negotiating tactics or do-yourself off-season guide. The information in here is just the first step before you make the jump from playing at home to playing on stage. Some of the general topics we're going to cover are basic contract terms and what players should know. We're going to go over why it's important to learn what teams want and what the industry standards are. We'll go over how to figure out what you want and then translate that into a contract that you're going to like. We're going to go over some important people like agents and lawyers, what they do and why you need them. Then finally, we'll go through what an off-season looks like and what you as a player can do to prepare for it. Before we get into it, I do have to say that this is not official legal advice. I'm not a lawyer. The information in this presentation is also a combination of my experiences working with a lot of different players, teams, managers, agents, lawyers across a lot of different titles. It doesn't represent any one team, it doesn't represent any one contract or one esport. I also want to say that this is dedicated to my friend who kind of trusts everyone he knows and still hasn't fired his useless agent because, and I quote, he seems like a good guy. You know who you are. Let's start with why. Why is information important? There's a concept in contract theory and economics called information asymmetry. It has to do with decisions in a transaction where one party or one person has a lot more information or a lot better information than the other person. Esports is a pretty young industry compared to a lot of other high-performing sports. Therefore, contract negotiations between esports players and teams is a pretty good example of this. Most new players that I've talked to don't know who to ask for help, what their value is, what the industry standards are. On the other side, teams and organizations who have been operating in the space for a long time obviously have a lot more information and the resources they need. So when a team who has a lot more understanding of the space and a player who doesn't even know where to go for help try to come to an agreement, it leads to a lot of one-sided contracts in the team's favor. The purpose of this primer in this video is to help even the playing field. I want to empower the players, especially new to the industry, to make better and more informed decisions about where to go for help and what they should be thinking about. Before we get into contracts, I think players need to understand how they provide value and why they're getting paid. Professional esports is a business. It's about money. Fans watch players because of their skill of the game and their personal brand. Fans gravitate towards players and teams that win and connect with them the most. This is relevant because each fan has a certain amount of disposable income or money. For publishers like Riot, this might mean that those fans will then play their games and spend money there. If publishers create a league and invite teams to take part in it, they can also go and get league sponsors who spend money on the league to get the fans to buy their products. Riot keeps some of this sponsor money and distributes it to the other teams in the league to run their operations. Teams make money from sponsors and also from any in-game icons or other products that Riot or other publishers sells in their game. The teams who win and tell their stories the best to the audience gain the most fans. Sponsors can then go to teams directly and pay those teams to get their players to endorse and sell their products. Teams also make money by selling things like merchandise, digital assets, anything that their company is involved in. So it is really important for players to understand these relationships, at least at a basic level, and know what part they play. Professional players who, based on their skill, can help the team win the most, and also with a brand that attracts fans to watch the league that they're a part of, are making money for teams, publishers, sponsors, and everyone else in the ecosystem that they interact with. So when a player signs a contract, they are entering into a business relationship. Professional players are high-performing athletes. They have harsh practice hours and competition schedules. By playing for a team, you as a player are providing your skill, your leadership and experience. You're asked to do things like stream, do interviews, appear in ads. You're providing a lot of your time and your image for teams and sponsors in the league to sell whatever product they are selling. The team is paying the players and providing the resources based on what is best for themselves. Players sometimes forget that or romanticize this relationship between a player and the team. They sometimes don't understand what value they're providing. I've seen a lot of young players who feel like they're just lucky to play as a pro player. They're happy to simply get to a point where they're playing and they will sign anything the team will put in front of them. Some even believe that it's rude to negotiate or ask for too much, and they just hope or think the team will do what's best for them. A player once even asked me if they're betraying their teammates if they explored other offers. I can assure you that every team is constantly thinking of ways that can improve their roster, and it's possible that that doesn't include you. They wouldn't think twice about replacing a player if they found someone who is better. In fact, as a business, that's what most teams should do in order to be successful. Teams are not your friends. You can be close with your managers, your players, your teammates, but you cannot be friends with an entity that is signing your paycheck. It is up to the players to recognize the value that you bring and get compensated appropriately. It is the players' responsibility to take care of themselves and their own interests. Let's break down what a contract looks like. When a player and team want to work together, they negotiate on a set of terms like player services and compensation. The team usually creates the contract, and once it's signed, a contract is a formal and legally binding agreement between the player and a team. Each contract is different and will cover a lot of different and unique terms. You'll have different contracts for level of competition across esports, and even the teams in the same ecosystem will have their own contract structure and what terms that they value. Here are 10 of the most common impactful contract terms that I think every player should know before signing a contract. First, let's look at base salary. This section describes how much you're getting paid and when. Salary is usually a fixed amount. You get paid every other week or every month. When you're negotiating, however, you usually talk about how much you're going to make per year. This number doesn't include things like bonuses, penalties, and prize money. Next, let's look at salary reductions. Most contracts will leave room for teams to reduce the player's salary. These can be one-time penalties or permanent reductions. Common penalties can include things like bad behavior or not fulfilling certain requirements. Permanent reductions can happen, for example, if a team benches the player and moves them to an academy roster. Term length. This is the amount of time that the contract lasts. In League of Legends, contracts usually have a term limit of 3 or 4 years. Parts of contracts can also change during the term. For example, a player's responsibilities can change based on time of year. Salary can increase or decrease from year to year. Trade rights. These are rules that govern if and how teams can trade players and assign their contracts. Trades can be as complicated or as simple as the terms that are set. In League of Legends, for example, there are restrictions on when teams can trade and sell players. There are also rules that control where a team can send players and how much they can charge for the buyout. Most importantly, these rules define how much players have a say in this process. Next, let's consider termination rights. These talk about how and when a player and a team can break off the contract. There are really two ways to terminate a contract, either with cause or without cause. The contract should list a lot of different reasons why an organization or a player can terminate with cause. An example would be if a player commits a felony and the court charges him with it, then the team should be allowed to terminate without any penalty. A termination without cause usually has a lot of established rules. For example, a team who chooses to terminate without cause might need to pay the player 2 months' salary or give them notice, or could only do it within a certain time frame. Next, let's look at sponsors, streaming, and content requirements. These parts in your contract refers to ways players have to leverage fans to provide value to the teams. So for example, players may be required to stream certain amounts during the contract term. When players stream, they obviously display ads that direct fans to teams and sponsor products. Players also have to appear in branded content or sponsored ads. Finally, most players have to use their social media to promote and endorse teams and sponsors. So this section usually covers how much players have to do and what they have to do. Bonuses come in many forms, most notable of which is the performance bonus. Team-based esports generally have performance bonuses tied to team performances and individual achievements. Bonuses for team achievements can include things like playoff placements, wins in major tournaments. Teams could award bonuses for individual awards like Best in Role or MVP. Individual bonuses are another common type. To earn these bonuses, players must complete high benchmark actions. For example, let's say the average player streams 250 hours, but a team wants to incentivize players to stream more. Then they may set a bonus in their contract for a player if he streams 500 hours during a given year. Next, let's look at food, travel, housing, and just benefits in general. This section details how a team will provide these benefits. For example, teams could have chefs cook meals for players, or they can give players a stipend. Depending on the esport and the level of competition, each esport has a very different standard operating practice based on competition structure, location, how much teams have to travel, prize money. So this section kind of covers how tournament organizers send prize money to teams and how it's distributed. This section covers what percentage of prize money the player will receive and when he will get it. Next, let's look at IP rights. Image rights argue that every individual has the right and ability to decide how their picture, name, or voice is used. This section covers what is being signed over to the organization and how they can be used. Teams need these rights for things like media, promotions, and merch. Teams also transfer these rights to sponsors, tournament organizers, and publishers. This section covers what teams can do with these rights and how long they can use them. Finally, independent sponsorships. This section in the contract usually talks about how and when players can pursue their independent sponsors. Each team has a set of products or sponsors that players usually have to promote or perform services for. This also means that players can't endorse competing products or sponsors. But if there are categories that don't conflict with the team sponsors, for example, if a team doesn't have a shoe sponsors, maybe players can go sign independent deals with companies like Nike or Adidas. I do want to say at this point that just to keep things simple, there are other common contract terms that I have kept out of this, including things like employee versus contractor, merchandising and digital goods split, confidentiality and not disparagement, liquidated damages. Highly encourage you to go ahead and Google them yourselves or speak to a lawyer to kind of explain a lot of those in a lot more detail. Now that we're familiar with some of the basic contract terms, let's dive a little deeper. Before starting any negotiation, there are 3 things that you really want to know. What do you want as a player? What the industry standards are? And what do teams want? It's only by understanding all 3 of these questions can you really negotiate properly. Let's first look at industry standards. Industry standards are common practices for the ecosystem you're in. It's really useful to know what these standards are for each category in your contract. Each esport has different standards due to a lot of different factors, so the more you know, the better prepared you will be to negotiate a contract. Let's look at an example. When Fortnite was in its prime, prize pools were really high compared to salary, especially for really competitive players. For really good players, this meant that retaining a high percentage of prize pool was really important. If you know that most teams are taking 20% and the team that you're negotiating against is asking for 40% of their prize pool, then you know something is off. You can then ask for a higher salary or other bonuses to kind of make up for the difference. This is only by knowing the industry standard was 20% can this player make better decisions about what to ask for. So what does this mean and how can you apply using industry standard for some of the basic terms? So let's say, for example, the average salary for an LCS player in 2020 was $400K and the median was $300K. The highest paid players in the league have reportedly earned somewhere between $2 to $3 million in 2021. Meanwhile, the minimum base salaries for all LCS players is $75,000. As a player, these numbers now give you a range to base your negotiations on. Similarly, housing, food, and travel have their own industry standards for league and other esports. So how can you learn more about industry standards? This is where it gets really tricky for younger players entering the scene because they often have no connections to anyone in the industry to help answer these questions. Fortunately for some groups like the LCS, there's the Players Association whose goal is to help younger players. So I recommend anyone who's joining the industry who has a group like the PA to please reach out to them and ask them for resources before they sign any contracts, just so they know what the industry standards are. If you're in a majority of esports that doesn't have this resource, the best way to do is connect and network with a lot of people in the industry as much as possible. But finally, even if you aren't able to do that, at a most basic level, it is your peers who are going to be your most important resource. If you know players who have joined certain teams or or who've gone through certain negotiations. You can ask them about their salary or their contract situation, who they spoke to in terms of getting help. It's only by sharing this information with each other that the players who are joining the ecosystem in the industry can make better decisions right off the bat. Teams all share information with each other about best practices, and it's about time for players to start doing the same. Let's look at what teams want next. It's pretty important for you as a player to understand where the team's coming from, where they place value, and what they think about cost and risk to help you negotiate. Every team is operating with a certain budget. The budget covers things like player salary, staff, housing, food, boot camps, performance programs, etc. The better the teams can negotiate salaries, the more they'll have for other operating costs. It could even give them a surplus that goes to other parts of the organization. Let's look at an example of how teams value players and how they manage cost and risk. This is obviously not the full picture of what the teams want. This is just one example of what could happen. Let's say a team wants to sign a player to a long-term contract. The reason why they would do that is because they have an internal idea of what the player's value is currently and what his value is going to be like in the next 3 years. In this example, the rookie they're talking to, his value is currently at 150K. But the team's coaches and analysts have told them that, hey, over the next few years, this player is going to get a lot better with experience, and he may actually be worth 300K or 500K if you're projecting what the market looks like in the next couple of years. The team now may offer the player 200K per year to sign a 3-year contract. They may now have a player for 600K over 3 years who may actually be worth almost $1 million. In this example, obviously, the team is taking a risk. They're giving the player slightly higher salary up front, assuming that the player's value is going to go up. But there are ways that teams can lower this risk. So, first, most important way that every team can reduce risk is by including salary reductions in the contract. The team may carve out a provision that allows them to bench a player. This player might either not play games or have to play in the academy league. This contract would also have a benched or academy level salary that will be significantly lower than what the actual salary is. So in our example again, if our player isn't performing well in the second year, then the team can just bench him and give him a significantly lower salary. Second, the team can just trade the player for a buyout. Let's say the player performed well but wasn't a culture fit, or if the team found a better player for that position, the team can then sell the contract after the first year. For the team, it is best if they have the ability to sell the contract without the player's consent. This allows them to approach as many teams as possible who are interested in the player and leverage different offers to get the highest buyout for themselves. Obviously, the more they get in the buyout, the more cost they recoup. Finally, teams will often have a termination without cause clause in the player contract. In this example, let's say the player isn't performing well by the end of the first year and the team isn't able to sell his contract. Coaches and analysts and the team are saying that, hey, it is unlikely this player improves to that level. At this point, the team can just end the relationship by paying fee, let's say a 1-month salary that was designated in the contract. These are just 3 ways that teams can, again, look at player value, offer them something that makes sense to them, but also minimize the risk. These are what I call the 5 core terms in a contract: base salary, term length, salary reductions, trade rights, and termination without cause. They control value and risk for both players and teams. So based on the terms that we've talked about so far, this is what the best case scenario for teams would look like. A contract that has low player salary, max term length, ability to bench player at any time and lower their salary, sell player to any team without consent, and terminate the contract at any time without cause. Let's take another small detour. Another rare contract clause to consider is the right of first refusal. A lot of major publishers and tournament organizers at the higher level of competition usually forbid this clause, but it does still exist in the esports ecosystem, and it's worth exploring. This clause essentially allows the team that has your contract to match any incoming offers to keep you as a player. Now, within certain bounds, this can be beneficial. Let's say that you're an amateur player under a certain team and you are not getting paid very much money, but another team wants to give you a higher salary and promote you into a higher league. The current team that you're on can match that salary and also promote you and keep you. This would allow teams to invest into amateur without fear of having their players stolen, while at the same time, when players' value increases, it gives them opportunity to move up in level and also receive salary bumps. Where this contract clause becomes problematic is when it applies at the end of contracts. So let's say that player has finished his amateur career with the team and is now speaking to other teams about opportunities. If his old team still has the ability to match offers and keep him, this means that a short-term amateur contract with a very little salary can actually have control over where this player can look for opportunities in the future. This clause can be really prevalent in other esports and might make it hard for some players to break free. This becomes another way for teams to convert low-risk deals with younger, inexperienced players into high-value, long-term assets. Let's now consider other contract terms from the team's perspective. Let's look at streaming first. Teams usually use player stream channels to advertise their products and sponsors. The team may have a deal in place with streaming platforms like Twitch. Teams can incentivize players by adding bonuses in their contracts, or they can set streaming minimums where if the players don't hit them, teams can deduct a part of their salary. Next, let's consider sponsor and content requirements. Teams don't often know how many sponsored deliverables and activations that the players are required to do over the course of the term. So in order to give the teams more flexibility, teams are often vague with what and how much players have to do. So for example, let's say during the second year of a player's contract, the team signs 2 additional sponsors who want to create a lot of content around that one player. The teams can then ask the players to meet fans, create content, promote on social media. The less restrictions there are on the contract, the more the teams can ask the players to do that's needed. Bonuses. So teams use bonuses to reward achievements or, again, incentivize certain behaviors. If a player has a large stream following, for example, a team may set bonuses for certain benchmarks, like hitting a certain number of stream hours. Obviously, the value that the team gains from player streaming that number might far surpass the cost of the bonus. Similarly, when teams reward achievements, teams do an analysis of how likely it is to occur and the value of that to the team. For example, if a player is set to receive a bonus of $50,000 for winning the MVP award in the contract, when the team negotiated that contract, they may believe the player has a 10% chance of winning the award. This makes the expected cost to be about $5,000. Also, if the player wins the MVP and has signed a longer contract, the value of the potential player buyout may increase and sponsors may want to utilize the additional player value. Let's talk about food, travel, and housing. Teams vary in how they provide benefits to players. Team first started providing housing and food to make it easier on both players and themselves to run their operation. But now, some teams have started to hire chefs and pay for apartments or team houses. This removes the burden from the players so they can focus on the game. Teams can also coordinate with players and instill healthy habits. But this also increases operational costs for teams. Some teams therefore choose to provide stipends to players equal to the value of rent or the food to avoid this. This obviously gives a lot more choices for players in where to live or what to eat, but it also means that the players have to deal with all the additional logistics. Now let's talk about image rights. Teams need the ability to use the player's likeness and image for publicity and branding. Teams also need the ability to transfer these rights to sponsors and publishers. Teams want to be flexible in what they can do with these rights and how long. For example, a player does a sponsor shoot, their pictures are promoting a product that's in stores around Europe. The player's contract ends in a few months. These rights can determine how long the pictures of the players can remain in the stores, endorsing the sponsor's products. Finally, independent sponsorships are tricky for teams. Generally, teams want to limit players getting independent sponsors because even if the team doesn't have, for example, a shoe sponsor, they may be pursuing one. If a player gets his own shoe sponsor, it may complicate the deal or lower the value for the team. Let's now flip over and start talking to the player side. Before we even get into how players should look at contracts, I think every player should ask themselves, what do I want? When asked this question, most players will say that they want to join the best team. Some will talk about compensation, being able to build their brand. Some players even take it 1 year at a time. Others want to have long-term plans. The more you as a player can answer what you want, the better you can negotiate and leverage offers. Let's look at 2 examples. One from a perspective of a rookie player and another from a veteran. Let's say you're an experienced player late in their career, you might have a family. At this point, what you're looking for is monetary stability. Stability for you might mean a good salary and a guaranteed contract. A guaranteed contract is one where a team cannot terminate without cause or lower salary. This would mean that the player would get the full value of the contract and may even prefer signing a longer term. In this case, maybe the player does not care about trade rights. It doesn't matter to him where he gets traded as long as the new team will just cover the value of the contract. Another experienced player may have drastically different priorities. They may be looking to join a team with the roster that they prefer, but the budget may not be super high. First, it'd be important for this player to secure consent rights for trades. If he values playing with specific people, he should make sure that he can't get sent to a team he doesn't want. Next, let's say he's an experienced player who also has a solid brand and enjoys streaming. If the team isn't able to pay him his true value, he can work with the team to carve out independent sponsorship exemptions for himself. This way, he can make up the salary difference and play for the roster that he wants. Finally, let's consider options for rookie players. It's usually important for talented rookies to be flexible about their options. The early years of a player's career are really important development years. Team selection, including roster, staff, and other resources, may be super important. So again, consent rights over trades are super crucial to make sure that you have a choice over where you go. A rookie player's trajectory can change drastically from year to year. If you improve a lot, you want to make sure that you can negotiate your contract to match your value. Therefore, shorter term contracts usually allow you to see more off seasons and leverage other offers so you can be compensated as your value increases. While they matter, salary levels should really not be a big consideration for rookies at this level. As a rookie, you're trying to find the best plays to increase your value. The difference between a $65,000 contract and an $85,000 contract is nothing, because if you're in a place in a team that can help build you up the most, then in year 2 or year 3, that can mean the difference between a $300,000 contract and a $500,000 contract. This is why players should know where they are in their careers and what they want. Simple ideas like stability and flexibility can help shape what is important for you in the core contract. Before, we talked about what the team would consider the best contract would be for them. On the other hand, we have the player contract exodia, which probably looks something like a high player salary, preferred contract length, no salary reductions, consent rights over trades, and a no termination without cause. If you look at this graphic, on one hand, you have a contract that heavily favors the team, and on the other hand, you have a contract that heavily favors the player. Only players who are in high demand can ask for a contract like this because many teams will be willing to sign them on because of their high value. On the other hand, if you're one of the best teams, you'll be able to get a contract that heavily favors you because you have a lot of players who are vying for the same position. But in most cases, you're going to have compromise between what players and teams want in a contract. So in the next section, we're going to look at how compromises work in contracts and some examples. In order to compromise on the player's perspective, you want to clarify and you want to set conditions. This is how you manage risk for both the players and the teams. So let's look at some examples. If you are a player who wants to join a certain roster, but the team is offering you a really low base salary, you can ask to move the difference in salary expectations to bonuses. Again, if you don't need the money immediately, you can also offer an alternative payment plan. For example, the team can pay you a part of the salary during the first year and rest from the second year's budget. You can also ask for a scaling contract where first year contract is low, but it increases over the next 2 years as long as you have a contract that is guaranteed. When it comes to things like term length, team will often want long contracts as long as they're not guaranteed. It is risky for players to sign on to long contracts, but let's say you are a player who still wants to join this team and whose highest priority is performance. So, for example, if you joined the team because you believed to be a top 3 team, you can ask for a condition that states that if the team falls below top 5 multiple splits in the row, then you can leave the contract. You may still be in a long contract, but at least you get the security and the priorities that you want. Next, let's talk about salary reductions. The problem with them is they're often vague. If the teams can penalize you for bad behavior or bench you, there should be a real clear reason why. If you're signing a contract as a starter and the team can bench you at any time and lower your salary, you are not a starter. Clarifying when teams can use these clauses and for how long is crucial if they're going to exist. Consider penalties for bad behavior. Is there a rule book or code of conduct you have to follow? Are there any warnings before it affects your salary? Who decides these penalties? Can you appeal to them? If a team reduces your salary, there should be a clear process in place. Similarly, when you look at benching, the team should specify the reasons why. It does not make sense to sign a long contract, and if a team can find a better player, they can bench you at any time and lower your salary. You can argue for salary reductions that are tied only to behavioral-based reasons. If a clause does remain, you can also ask to leave a contract or explore options if you've been benched for 1 or 2 months. Next, let's look at provisions on benefits. While every team provides housing, food, travel, and health insurance, the how differs. Clarifying what you are getting and how much it's valued is important. Without specifying, housing and food can mean a lot of different things. It can mean you have to share a room with 1 or more players. It can mean a $10 stipend per meal. Here you can specify if they provide housing, what and where it'll be. Will there be shifts? How many meals and times a week will you receive meals? Will this extend into the off-season? If the teams are providing a stipend, how is it paid? If teams pay you a stipend as part of your taxable income, you're getting less value. So let's say a team gives you a $1,500 room, or they can give you a $1,500 stipend. After taxes, the stipend might only be worth $1,000. Next, signing over your rights to your name and likeness. The main priority here should be to make sure that the team can't create assets using your image after the term. The negotiation may lie in what to do with the assets that are created during your term. For example, how long can teams sell merch with your face or name on it? Are they allowed to sell the inventory they already have in stock before you leave the team? What about sponsor ads in department stores? How long are those allowed to stay up there? These can affect your future prospects. What happens if you want to sign an independent sponsorship with Adidas, but Nike is still running a Twitch ad with you in them? These restrictions may not affect everyone or even apply, but this is a section that you must review with your lawyer to understand the implications. So far in our conversation, we've talked about basic contract terms, industry standards and why they're important, team side and what they prioritize, and how players can think about what they want, translate what they want into the contracts, and compromise. Next, we're going to talk about a few people in the space who can help players. Player agents are one of the most important resources for players, depending on what services they provide. The main goal of a player agent is to find the best teams and partners for what you want as a player. Most agents are still focused on negotiating player contracts and helping find independent sponsors. So let's talk about how agents are useful. Agents have relationships with GMs and management as most teams. They also know the player base pretty well in each scene. They know what teams want and how they operate and negotiate. They also work with a lot of players, press, sponsors, and publishers. This knowledge and network is their most important asset. So when a player understands what they want, they can come to the agent and tell them what they want, and then the agent can help them translate that into a deal. For some players, this may sound great. You're basically hiring someone who does all the work for you and takes a small cut of your salary. Chances are you would also make more by working with an agent than what his cut is. It feels like the relationship pays for itself. But this type of thinking has actually led to some poor decisions and bad contracts for players. So what we're going to talk about next is what things to consider before you hire an agent and which agent to hire. First, it often feels like players forget that agents are also not your friends. You are paying the agent to do something for you. The biggest mistake I've seen players make is that they trusted agents to know what they wanted. Most agents default to getting their players the most amount of money as possible. But in doing that, agents may give up other rights that are important to you. Some agents might even believe that's what you want. Others may not know any better or do what's best for themselves. This is why even if you hire an agent, it's important to know the basics. You have to combine what you want out of a contract with their experience to figure out what's best for you. Finding the best agent is like finding the best team for yourself. You have to align on what you need and what they can offer. So let's ask some questions about how to find an agent. First, how much does the agent know about the teams I want to join and the players that are competing for the spot? Agents have a lot of specific regions and networks that they excel in. So let's say you're a European player and you've been talking to an agency that operates in France. They maybe have great connections in the LFL and LEC, but you might also want to consider LCS teams. They may not have the best connections there. They don't know what some of the teams are looking for or the contract nuances in that region. You probably will be better served by looking for an agency that works in multiple regions than a specialist who works in LFL and LEC. Next, if you were to hire this agent or agency, how important would you be as a client to them? Sometimes it may seem that an agency is impressive because they have a roster of a lot of players. I know players who've come to me have talked to about a certain agency because they just have the best players. But that also means that they may have less individual time for you. You may not be on the high in their list of priorities. You might get a less experienced agent to work with you rather than the ones working with top clients. On one hand, having a lot of players means they have a lot of information about team rosters and context. But it also means they may have clients that are fighting for the same spots you are. Let's say you're a support player who signs on to an agency, but that agency also represents three other support players who are fighting for the same spots you are. How can an agency look out for your best interest when they're working also with your direct competitor? Next, what you want to ask is, what services can they provide to me? Sometimes a player agent may not be the best fit for you or the only agency you need. A talent agency who specializes in sponsor deals might be more important for you if you have a big brand. You can sign on to one agency for helping you find a team and another for sponsor deals. If you have a lot of experience in the space and need legal help, maybe a lawyer is just a better fit for you than an agent. Next, let's talk about lawyers. What do they do and if you need one? When we talk about agents, they are industry experts who help you negotiate for what you want. Once you and the team come to terms, the team will send out a contract for you to look at. This is where a lawyer is important. It is the lawyer's job to make sure that the terms that you wanted and negotiated are represented clearly in a legal sense. What that means is every contract will identify a place whose rules and laws will govern the agreement. The lawyer will make sure that the contract is consistent with these rules. Most agents don't have the legal training to do this. Every reputable agent and agency will contract a lawyer to help look over your contract. Even if you don't have an agent, every esport player must have a lawyer look over their contract. Teams have used teams of lawyers to draft the contract you are about to sign. Most of the language in there is likely to favor the team. No player should ever sign a contract without having a lawyer look it over. So far, we've talked about player contract terms, industry standards, team perspective, lawyers, and agents. Let's now talk about how an offseason works. What is an offseason? An offseason is a time where there's very few or no competitive games going on. This is often when a lot of teams look to make changes to their roster and coaching staff. As a player, you're probably in one of these three spots going into an offseason. You're either a free agent, which means you're able to talk to any team, you're still under contract until a certain date in the offseason, or you're still contracted to a team for one or more seasons. Before we even get into the player side of the offseason, let's talk about the offseason from the team's perspective. Just to keep things simple, we're going to talk about budget, preparation, and negotiations. First, every team has a budget. There's usually some wiggle room, but you can categorize them into three different buckets. First is the highly competitive bucket. These teams will probably spend to be the best. Second is the middle of the pack bucket. They'll usually be smart about their budget. Sometimes they'll be up a tier if they find that they have a star player that they can get, or they could be lower if they feel like that's not the best time for them to spend their money. The third tier is the cost savings tier. For this type of team, the lowest cost is generally the most important. They usually want to sell off their high valued assets for as much as possible, and they want to wait until the end of the offseason so they can pick up the best players left, have the highest value for the lowest amount of cost. You can generally tell the team's budgets based on which teams are setting the pace of the offseason. Next, we have teams with different levels of preparation. So you have teams who sort of act last minute. They generally don't have a plan until they conduct their postseason interviews with their coaches and staff, and then they start preparing for what an offseason looks like. The next tier above that is teams who are more reactionary to the season that's currently ongoing. They had a plan of roster and staff going into this year, and based on what players are working out and what staff are working out and which aren't, they look to make changes to that based on the available. Usually in the middle of the season, they'll start creating lists of targets that they want to go after in the offseason based on who's a free agent and what their budget looks like for buyouts. Finally, you have the type of team who plans in a multi-year phase. They develop multi-year targets on their academy teams. They're constantly tracking people around the world at different levels to make sure that whenever their value far exceeds what their cost is, they get picked up for their own programs. On their own teams, they generally are looking at players and know before that season even starts what their development curve looks like, how much value they're going to provide during the season, and they constantly have a list and an idea of what players they're going to be looking at next offseason and which the most sense to replace and which to keep. Generally, you can tell the teams that have the best preparation. You can usually tell that because these teams want to learn as much information about the field as possible, and that's why they're talking to you as a player or as a staff member, not necessarily because they want to pick you up, but more they want to learn more about you and the people that you. Let's talk about negotiations from both the team side and the player side. For both, your negotiating power comes from the perception of the teams that are interested in you and what value they're placing on you as a player. So for example, if as a player, you're negotiating in a position where 9 other teams are already locked up for their spot, you only have one team that you're talking to, you don't have a lot of leverage. You might have to accept a really terrible contract or anything they put in front of you, or you may have to take that season off. Similarly, if you know that a team wants you and another player, and the other player decides to join a different team, then you have a lot of leverage in that situation because you may have other teams that want you, but that team only has you. So you can ask for what you want. This is why knowledge in the offseason is super important for both players and teams. Teams need to know which spots are being filled up, what other teams are doing, where other players are going to make sure that first, second, third choice aren't already gone because that will pay a premium for the player that they want. Similarly, if they're trying to sell players, they want to make sure that the targets that they're trying to sell them to are also still available because that changes their negotiating power against other teams. For players, it's the same. You want to make sure that whenever you strike a deal or whenever you're trying to negotiate, you come from a position where you have a lot of options. Otherwise, the team will be able to dictate what they're going to give you. This is what I recommend for players going into an offseason. It doesn't really matter what position you're in, you need to know what's going on. If you're a player already on a team, then you can help your team make better decisions in the offseason by sharing information with them. If you're a player who's a free agent, then this gives you a better sense of when to negotiate and how. Things that are important to know are what changes teams are making, who's staying and who's leaving, and what teams are looking at. For example, if you're looking for a position in the LEC as an AD carry, you know that 3 teams are looking for AD carry positions. Then you know who you can go to, who you can negotiate against, and who your backups are going to be. The important thing is to constantly keep up this information during the offseason. So if you're negotiating with your target team, you want to make sure that the other 2 teams still haven't locked up their positions and they're kept as backups. Because as soon as those positions lock up, your negotiating power goes down and you have to accept anything that the team puts in front of you. Second, you want to know the salaries and buyouts that teams are offering. And third, you want to make sure that you know who your competition is. So again, if you're an AD carry looking for one of those 3 spots, chances are they're also looking at a few players compared to you. So if you're looking at your target team and they're looking at 2 players, you and someone else, if you know where your competition is going or what they're doing, then it puts you in a better position to negotiate. If your competitor or the person they were looking at now joins another team, then you're in a much better spot. Again, it's super important to be prepared, know the information going into the offseason, and constantly update your information as the offseason goes on. Agents are a really good resource to help you do this. Agents are obviously constantly talking to all of the teams. They have a roster of players under them so that they know where they're going, who they're talking to. The biggest asset an agent provides to players is their network and their resources that helps you make the best decisions at the right time. We've already talked about why it's super important to be prepared in an offseason and why it's important to constantly be updated in an offseason. So then let's talk about how it happens. This is called the information economy of an offseason. It's where every team, every player, every agent, every staff member, all of the media are sharing information with each other. It's important to note that some information may be true, some information may be partly true, some information may be conditional, and some information may even be false. There's some information that is shared because you want to collect other information. There's some information that might be shared because there's intent behind the sharing of that information. Sometimes rumors come up that don't get clarified, sometimes they do. This is why for especially new players coming in, agents are actually a very crucial piece because they've been through this before. They know which teams and players and agents to talk to get the right information. There's information that's out there that can boost your value or get you a negotiation edge. there's information that's out there that's meant to drive out or confuse competition, it is crucial that as a new player, you don't know how to work in this economy, so you work with an agent or someone else that can help you navigate the offseason. I've seen an example of a coach who only had a few offers, but then a rumor broke out coincidentally where he was talking to a prominent team. Now, as soon as that rumor broke out, his negotiations with those two teams that he was talking to sped up a lot. That rumor may have been true, that rumor may have been false, but just the perception of that rumor changed how his negotiation went. Similarly, I knew a player 2 off seasons ago that was looking to move to the LCS, but there was a rumor that said that he isn't actually looking to try very hard when he moves to the LCS. He wants to either retire or chill. And this turned a lot of teams off to picking up this player, regardless of what that player's value was. So, disinformation economy and how hard it is to navigate without any resources is probably the number one reason I recommend players to work with agents. Agents have a lot of network and connections within the scene, and they can help you properly navigate this. I know most players can understand contract terms, maybe even negotiate for themselves against teams. They can probably just work with lawyers to get what terms that they want, but knowing what your value is, what information changes your value and negotiating position is something that especially new players, I think are going to find it a big challenge to do themselves. So then let's talking about specific players going into an offseason. I think every free agent should have a post on their social media and find a way to signal boost it. It should include your accomplishments. If you have a brand, then any brand info if necessary. Talk about your important experiences or qualifications and qualities. Share your solo queue pounds and how high they are, and any references. Finally, make sure that you leave a way to reach you or your agent. For free agents, the beginning of the process is fairly straightforward. Make a post, tell teams how to reach you, and find a way to signal boost. Next, again, for free agents or if you're being traded, here's what else you can do to prepare. First, you want to continue playing solo queue and hit the highest rank possible. From the team perspective, it looks really good if you're motivated and you are still trying to grind as hard as possible, even in the offseason. It is even more valuable if you have the time and resources to go do this in Korea. If in the offseason you're in Korea and you hit top 30 or top 40, then any team who's going to be looking at you on the League of Legends side is going to be a lot more impressed. Next, it's crucial to keep up with the meta and prepare for tryouts. I've known players who attended tryouts after a 2 or 3 week break and they were really rusty, they didn't know how to communicate, and they took a long time to get back into the groove of things, and by then the tryouts were already over. They never got to show off their real value. So the off season is not the time to take a break until your contract is signed and you know what the next year looks like. Always make sure you're grinding super hard and preparing for either tryouts or getting traded. Next, find resources to help you prepare for interviews. A lot of players haven't gone through an interview process because they're super young, they've never had to apply to colleges or do a lot of presentations. I think that if you work with an agent or even someone local to you who can help you do and prepare for interviews, it's going to help you a lot when you talk to teams, especially when you are younger and teams don't know you and first impressions matter. Finally, and I mentioned this before, constantly keep getting updated on what's going on and constantly talk to your agents and other teams. So let's talk about players under contracts. If you're not getting traded or you're not a free agent, chances are that teams may approach you and talk to you about a contract extension. What a contract extension is, add an additional year to your contract in exchange for a higher salary or different contract terms. So for players, what I would recommend is considering a contract extension by looking at it as a new contract. First, if you didn't have an agent who worked with you when you signed your original contract, you can always get one now and have them help you through it, because you want to compare the value that the team is offering compared to the value you would get if you were to go free agent at the end of your contract. So if the team is offering you a $100,000 bump per year for the next 2 years, it is possible that if you understood the market and know what the updated information about salaries and buyouts are, if you know what teams are going to be looking for players at the end of the next year based on whose contracts are running out, your value might actually be higher. So in some cases, it's better for players to wait out their contract and then go through free agency to get a higher value, and sometimes it is better for players to just sign a contract extension. But you should probably do the due diligence of making sure you figure out what your value is going to be as a player. If you look at both years together on the offer that team is offering and what your potential value would look like if you would just go free agent and sign a new contract. Finally, I would also take this time an opportunity to change other parts of your contract. When a team offers an extension, it doesn't mean that you're only changing your term or you're only changing your salaries. You can ask for changes to any other part of your contract as well. You can treat it as a new contract. You can now ask for potential trade rights. You can ask for changes to your termination with their rights clauses. You can ask for potential bonuses. You can ask for any changes when teams come to you with contract extensions. Let's quickly go through players who are still under contract until free agency date. In League of Legends, the free agency date is usually set to be around the middle of November. This means that players who are still under contract until that date cannot legally talk to or negotiate with other teams unless your current team gives you permission. The problem with this becomes that most rosters are usually sorted out by the time that the free agency date hits, so those players who have to wait until free agency date to negotiate with teams often are left with very few options and have very little negotiating power in what to do next. So obviously, there's a lot of ways that you can solve this, but one solution would be to just standardize the practice of giving players the ability to terminate the contract after the last game of the season on the last year of the contract. What this means is, let's say the player is on the last year of his contract and he played the last competitive game for the season for that team as like the last game of Worlds or the last game of playoffs. If the player terminates his contract, then obviously he won't get paid for the rest of the term, but it also means that that player now can go and explore free agency without having this restriction on it. So I wanted to quickly recap everything that we've gone through. First, we went through what the basic contract terms are and why it's important to learn them. Next, we talked about the industry standards and how they can help you create a basis for starting negotiations. Then we talked about the team perspective and how teams value players and how they leverage risk and how they put that onto the contract. Then we talked about the player side and how you should figure out what you want, both from a contract side and personally, and using that, you can adjust the contract to what makes sense for you. Then we talked about some of the resources you have to help you, including agents and lawyers. Finally, we talked a little bit more about the offseason, how teams approach the offseason, what the information economy looks like, how that can affect negotiations. And finally, we talked about what players in different levels can do in order to approach the offseason. Hopefully this gives you a little more idea of how to approach contract negotiations and everything that surrounds it. If I didn't cover anything or if you need help, please reach out to me or DM me on Twitter. Even if I can't help you directly, I can at least help point you in the right resources.